A new beginning. Jonathan stood frozen for a moment, watching his son's retreating figures as they sulked toward the entrance of the orphanage. He had hoped for more from them, more understanding, more compassion. But the reality was, they didn't yet see the bigger picture. Not fully, anyway. Emily, with her natural grace and optimism, broke the tension by tugging on Jonathan's hand, drawing his attention back to the present moment. Her eyes met his, sparkling with anticipation. "I can't wait to meet her," she said, her voice filled with that warm, youthful hope that always made Jonathan's heart swell. He smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering belief in people, in the goodness of the world, even when life had dealt her an unfair hand. She was the reason he had started this journey in the first place. She was the one who had reminded him that sometimes a single act of kindness could change a person's life forever. It wasn't just about charity. It was about understanding, about giving someone the opportunity to rise above their circumstances. "Let's go, Em," Jonathan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. They approached the entrance, Emily's small hand still clutching his. His sons trailed behind, their footsteps hesitant, almost reluctant. The lobby of the orphanage was a little worn around the edges, with chipped paint on the walls and outdated furniture that seemed to tell a story of countless children who had come and gone. There was a mix of faded hope and quiet resignation in the air, as if the building itself held the collective dreams of all the children who had spent their lives here. Jonathan's gaze softened as he took it all in. This place had been Emily's world for so long, and now it would be the starting point of something entirely new for another child. The woman behind the desk, Mary, greeted them warmly. Her face was familiar. She had been the one to first reach out to Jonathan all those years ago when Emily had come to them. "Mr. Weaver, Emily," she said, smiling at them both. "I'm so glad to see you again. And welcome, boys," she added, giving a polite nod to Nathan and Lucas, though she could tell they weren't particularly thrilled to be there. "We're here to see Tasha," Jonathan said, his voice steady but with a touch of pride as he glanced at his daughter. "Of course, right this way," Mary replied, leading them down a hallway. The walls were decorated with hand-drawn pictures from the children, bright colors, messy lines, and words of encouragement. It was a contrast to the otherwise sterile, institutional feel of the place, but Jonathan could see the spirit of hope that these kids still held on to. For them, their art was a window to a world beyond these walls. As they walked, Jonathan noticed that the younger children seemed to watch them with a mix of curiosity and longing. He could feel their eyes on his sons, his daughter, and himself, wondering what it would be like to have a family, to belong somewhere. He swallowed hard, pushing the familiar knot of guilt back down. Was it enough just to visit, to show them kindness, or should he be doing more, fighting harder to give them what they needed? When they reached the small, open playroom, Jonathan's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Tasha. She was sitting in the far corner, her small body curled up on a beanbag chair, absorbed in a book. She had dark, curly hair and an intense expression on her face. She was young, only 7, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something resilient, something familiar. It reminded him of Emily when she had first arrived in their home, unsure but determined to find her place in the world. Emily, without a second thought, rushed toward Tasha, her feet light and quick. The girls' eyes met, and Tasha blinked in surprise. Emily stopped just short of her, offering a warm, welcoming smile. "Hi, I'm Emily," she said softly, sitting beside her. Tasha hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to Jonathan and then back to the girl beside her. There was wariness in her eyes, a guardedness that spoke volumes about her past. She had been through so much, far more than anyone her age should ever have to endure. But there was a flicker of something else, something Jonathan couldn't quite place. "I'm Tasha," the little girl whispered, her voice barely audible as she spoke, her fingers still tracing the pages of her book, though her attention had shifted. Jonathan watched the interaction quietly from the doorway. Emily's warmth was immediate, her kindness almost palpable. She wasn't pushing. She wasn't demanding anything. She was just being present, offering the kind of companionship Tasha hadn't experienced in a long time. He could see that Emily had an understanding of what it meant to feel like an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit anywhere. And she was offering Tasha the one thing she needed most right now: chance at a fresh start. Nathan and Lucas stood back, exchanging uncomfortable glances but remaining silent. It was clear they weren't entirely sure how to react to the situation. They had been reluctant to come in the first place, and now it seemed they were unsure about their role in all of this. Jonathan decided to approach them, pulling them aside quietly. "You don't have to understand it all right now," he said, keeping his voice low. "But remember, sometimes the smallest gesture can make the biggest difference. That's all I'm asking. Just be here, for her and for yourselves." Nathan glanced at his father with a raised eyebrow, but Lucas seemed to soften just a bit. "Yeah, well, it's kinda hard to ignore how serious this is when you're actually here." Jonathan gave him a nod, appreciative of the acknowledgement. "Exactly. And this is real. What we're doing here matters, whether you see it yet or not." Inside, Emily was already in the process of drawing with Tasha, her colorful markers spreading across a piece of paper. Tasha had finally set her book aside, and she was now leaning in, adding her own touches to the picture. For the first time, she looked at ease, the wariness in her eyes replaced by curiosity and a budding sense of comfort. Jonathan could see it already, the way Emily had connected with her, how a simple moment of kindness had bridged a gap that had seemed impossible to cross. Jonathan stood at the doorway for a moment longer, watching the two girls, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. This was what mattered. This was why he had fought so hard for this family, for this moment. He had brought Emily into his life. And now, in turn, she was showing him how to make a difference. It was more than just a visit to an orphanage. It was about giving someone, anyone, a chance to experience love, warmth, and the sense of belonging they deserved. As he watched his family, Jonathan couldn't help but feel that something much bigger than him was at play. This wasn't just about adopting a child. It was about changing lives, one small step at a time. And with Emily and Tasha leading the way, he felt more hopeful than he had in a long time. The meeting. As Jonathan watched from the doorway, his heart warmed at the sight of Emily and Tasha bonding over their drawings. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. Tasha, the girl who had once seemed so withdrawn, was now actively participating in something joyful. The change was subtle but undeniable. Mary, the orphanage worker, noticed Jonathan's lingering gaze and came over to stand beside him. "She's a special one," she said quietly, her eyes flicking to Tasha. "She's been through more than any child should have to, but she's a fighter. You can see it in her eyes." Jonathan nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the years he had spent working with Emily, trying to give her the sense of safety and belonging that she had never known. He had seen Emily's resilience grow day by day. But Tasha was different. There was a wariness in her, a fear that made her hard to read. It wasn't that she didn't want to trust. She simply hadn't learned how to yet. Life had taught her to survive, not to embrace. "I can see that," Jonathan replied softly. "But she's got potential. Emily's really taking to her." Mary smiled, her face filled with compassion. "They remind me of each other. Emily's been through her own share of hardships, and yet look at her now. She's found her place. She can be the light Tasha needs. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person to show another that the world is bigger than what they've known." Jonathan's eyes never left the two girls, who were now sitting cross-legged on the floor, their heads close together as they focused on their drawings. Emily had started creating a colorful house with a flower garden around it, and Tasha, still hesitant, had drawn a large tree with wide, sheltering branches. The two of them exchanged a few words, and although Tasha's voice remained soft, her eyes were brighter, more engaged. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. The connection was there, growing between them. It was clear that Emily had a gift for seeing people where they were, not where the world had tried to make them feel they should be. And somehow, in that moment, Tasha was starting to see herself not as a victim, but as someone with possibilities. That was the first step. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to help her take the journey. As Emily and Tasha continued to draw, Nathan and Lucas wandered around the orphanage, their footsteps slow and deliberate. Jonathan could sense the growing tension in their faces, the internal struggle between their indifference, and the shift they were starting to feel. Neither of them said much, but Jonathan knew this experience was starting to affect them. It was subtle, but it was happening. "Dad, we're not staying here all day, are we?" Nathan asked finally, breaking the silence that had lingered between them. Jonathan turned to his son, his expression serious but patient. "We'll stay as long as it takes, but I want you to think about something while we're here, Nathan. This," he gestured toward the children in the room, "this is real. These kids need us. They need people who care. So no matter how uncomfortable it is right now, you're part of something bigger than you." Nathan frowned, his lips pressed tightly together, but he didn't argue. It was a small step, but Jonathan could see that it was a crack in the wall of indifference Nathan had built around himself. He wasn't ready to admit it, but Jonathan knew his son was beginning to feel the weight of the moment. Lucas, too, had been quiet, his eyes flicking around the room before landing on Tasha and Emily. He glanced at Jonathan, then back at the girls, before he spoke up. "I never thought about it like that, Dad. I mean, I knew people needed help, but I guess I didn't really know what it looked like." Jonathan nodded, his eyes softening. "That's okay, son. Sometimes you need to see it to understand it. But that's the beauty of it. You have the power to make a difference, just by showing up, by caring." Lucas looked away, his thoughts clearly drifting as he processed his father's words. It was a quiet moment, but Jonathan knew this was the beginning of something important. Both of his sons had the potential to change the world, to make it better. They just needed to learn that it wasn't about what you had, it was about what you gave. A few hours passed as Jonathan and his family spent time with the children at the orphanage. Emily and Tasha's bond deepened, and the rest of the children, some shy, others more outgoing, began to warm up to them. Nathan and Lucas, though initially reluctant, found themselves drawn into the activities, even if only by a sense of obligation at first. They helped organize a small game of tag, and Lucas, despite his usual grumbling, ended up laughing along with the kids as they ran around. As the afternoon wore on, Jonathan began to see a shift in his sons. They weren't fully transformed, but there was a noticeable difference in the way they interacted with the children. It was as if, for the first time, they were seeing the faces behind the statistics, seeing that every child had a story, a dream, and the right to have a family who cared for them. When it was finally time to leave, Emily looked at Jonathan, her eyes filled with that same excitement that had sparked in the car. "Dad," she said, squeezing his hand, "do you think Tasha will be okay? I want to make sure she knows she's safe with us." Jonathan smiled warmly, kneeling down to her level. "Emily, you've already made her feel safe. And together, we'll help her grow. We're her family now, just like you're my family. And that's something no one can ever take away." Nathan and Lucas came over, their faces more open than when they had first arrived. "Are we leaving already?" Nathan asked, though his tone was different now. It wasn't the same dismissive, sarcastic comment as before. It was genuine curiosity. Jonathan stood up, taking a moment to look at his sons. "We are. But remember what we talked about today. These kids don't have the same things we do, but we can make a difference, one small act of kindness at a time." Lucas nodded slowly, and even Nathan gave a faint smile. It wasn't much, but Jonathan could see the change. He had planted a seed, and he could only hope it would grow over time. The journey they were beginning was one that would take patience, understanding, and love. But Jonathan knew it was a journey worth taking. for Emily, for Tasha, and for all the children whose lives they would touch. As they left the orphanage, Jonathan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a much larger story, a growing connection. Weeks passed, and Jonathan found himself reflecting on that first visit to the orphanage more than he had anticipated. Tasha's quiet but determined demeanor had stayed with him, and Emily's growing bond with her seemed to be unfolding like a beautiful story that was just beginning. The time they spent together had brought a warmth and light to Tasha's life that she had never known before. Emily had a gift for making others feel seen and valued, and it was clear that she had become Tasha's first real friend. The once stubborn Jonathan's sons, Nathan and Lucas, had slowly begun to show signs of change as well. They were still teenagers and still somewhat distant at times, but they had begun to engage more with the world around them. It had started with small things, a smile at Tasha when she nervously asked for help with her art project, or the way Lucas quietly pulled out his phone to show her a funny video when she was feeling down. It wasn't dramatic, but Jonathan could see the shift. They were learning to open their hearts to people in need, just as he had hoped they would. One crisp Saturday morning, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee when Emily came bounding in, a notebook clutched in her hands. Her face was alight with excitement, a grin spreading from ear to ear. "Dad, guess what?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. Jonathan lowered his cup, intrigued by the energy in her voice. "What is it, Em?" "I was talking to Tasha yesterday, and she asked if she could come stay with us. She's ready. She said she feels safe with us, and she wants to be part of our family." Emily's voice trembled with excitement, her words rushing out in a quick breath. Jonathan felt a surge of emotion. He had hoped that Tasha would one day be ready to take the next step, but hearing it directly from Emily made it all the more real. He set his coffee down and pulled Emily into a tight hug. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done so much for her already. She's lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have her too," Emily responded, her voice soft and sincere. As they sat down together, Emily explained that Tasha had been talking to Mary, the orphanage worker, about her desire to move in with them. She had been quiet about her feelings before, unsure of how to ask, but after spending more time with Emily, she had found the courage to voice what she needed. She wasn't just looking for a place to stay, she was looking for a family, and Emily was the bridge that had made that possible. Jonathan smiled, but there was a slight twinge of concern in his heart. Adopting Tasha, welcoming her into their home permanently, was a decision that would affect all of them. He wanted to make sure it was the right time, not just for Tasha, but for the entire family. He had seen firsthand how hard it had been for Emily to adjust to her new life, and he didn't want to rush this process with Tasha. She needed time to heal, and they needed to ensure they were prepared for the responsibility that came with opening their home to another child. The next few days were filled with planning, phone calls, and meetings with the orphanage staff. Jonathan and Emily spoke with Mary about Tasha's readiness to move forward, and Mary assured them that Tasha had been showing remarkable progress. She had grown more open with the other children, had started to participate in group activities, and had even begun sharing stories about her past, small details that spoke to the depth of her experiences. By the end of the week, Jonathan had made the decision. Tasha would move in with them. The day Tasha arrived at their home was one of mixed emotions. Jonathan could tell that she was both excited and nervous, her small hands clutching the stuffed animal she had brought with her from the orphanage. It was the only thing she had left from her old life, and even though the toy was frayed and well-worn, it seemed to hold immense comfort for her. Emily was beside herself with joy, practically bouncing off the walls. She had been looking forward to this day for weeks, and now that it was finally here, she could hardly contain her excitement. Jonathan, too, was thrilled, but his mind was filled with a whirlwind of thoughts. Was Tasha truly ready? Would the adjustment be as smooth as they hoped? He had promised himself that they would provide a loving and safe environment for her, But he knew there would be challenges along the way. They spent the first few hours showing Tasha around the house, giving her a tour and explaining the routines they followed. Jonathan and Emily had already prepared a room for her, bright and welcoming, filled with new furniture and soft bedding that had been carefully chosen to make her feel comfortable. Tasha's eyes widened as she took it all in, her lips parted in awe. I get my own room?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't seem to grasp the concept that this was now her home too. "You sure do, Tasha," Jonathan replied gently, crouching down to her level. "This is your home now. You can make it your own however you like." Tasha nodded slowly, her hand still clutching the stuffed animal. She seemed unsure of how to respond to this kindness, as though she had never been given the freedom to choose her own space before. But Emily was quick to reassure her, taking her by the hand and guiding her into the room. "Let's pick out some posters for the walls. Maybe a few new books for your shelf." Tasha's eyes flicked up at Emily, the slightest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You really want to help me?" "Of course I do," Emily replied, her voice full of enthusiasm. "We're family now, and families help each other." For the first time, Tasha seemed to let her guard down, allowing herself to relax in Emily's presence. She didn't fully believe it yet, not completely, but it was a step forward. Jonathan could see the shift happening in real time. It wasn't going to be immediate, but with Emily's guidance, Tasha was slowly starting to believe that she deserved happiness, that she deserved love. That evening, they gathered around the dinner table, the familiar warmth of family filling the room. The food was simple, spaghetti with garlic bread, but it was a meal made with care, and it was shared by all. The conversation was light, with Emily and Jonathan doing most of the talking, but Tasha, who had been quiet throughout, began to speak up more as the meal progressed. She spoke softly at first, unsure of how to contribute to the laughter and banter. But as the night wore on, she started to feel more comfortable, responding to Emily's questions and even adding a few of her own. By the time the evening came to a close, Tasha had gone from a shy, withdrawn girl to someone who was beginning to feel like she truly belonged. She didn't have all the answers, and she certainly didn't have everything figured out, but she had taken the first step towards something better. Jonathan sat back in his chair, his heart swelling with pride. This was only the beginning, but he knew that this new chapter of their lives was one that would change them all forever. The struggles of adjustment. The first few weeks with Tasha in their home were a mixture of joy and challenges. Jonathan had known that the road ahead would not be easy, but he had hoped the adjustment would be smoother. As it turned out, the transition was anything but simple. Tasha was learning to live in a family, something she had never truly experienced. She had always been on her own, relying on the orphanage and the minimal support it could provide. Now, living in a home where she was surrounded by people who loved and cared for her, she was beginning to realize how much she had missed out on. But that realization came with its own struggles. At first, the changes seemed minor. Tasha was quiet at dinner, sometimes refusing to speak at all. She still clung to her stuffed animal as a comfort, as though it was the only piece of her past that could help her navigate this new life. She had a hard time adjusting to the concept of family routines, and sometimes she would withdraw to her room, as though she were afraid to let anyone in. Jonathan noticed it more with each passing day. She would sometimes look at Emily with uncertainty, as if she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Was this love conditional? Was she just being tolerated until the novelty wore off? Tasha's wariness was evident, and though Emily had an incredible ability to connect with her, it wasn't enough to erase years of abandonment and neglect. One afternoon, Jonathan found himself sitting across from Tasha in the living room. She was holding a sketchbook, her eyes flicking between the pages, but not really focusing on anything. Emily had gone to a friend's house, and the house felt quieter, somehow emptier without her usual bursts of energy. It was a good time for a conversation, one that Jonathan had been putting off for days. "Tasha," he began softly, his voice steady but warm. "I know it's been a lot of change for you. I want you to know that we're not going anywhere. You're safe here. You don't have to hide." Tasha's eyes flicked up at him briefly, and Jonathan could see the faintest trace of emotion in her gaze. But she didn't respond. Instead, she simply stared back down at the sketchbook, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the paper. Jonathan waited, giving her space, knowing that pushing her wouldn't help. He sighed, sitting back in his chair. "You don't have to pretend with me, Tasha. I know this is difficult, but I'm here for you. We all are." After a long pause, Tasha finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was a sharpness to her words. "I don't belong here," she muttered, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I'm just going to mess everything up. People like me, we're not meant to have families." Jonathan's heart clenched at the raw pain in her words. It was a fear he had anticipated but hadn't fully understood until now. Tasha didn't just feel like an outsider. She felt like she didn't deserve any of this. She couldn't comprehend that a family might actually want her, that she could have a place at the table, that her presence was not a mistake. He leaned forward, his expression soft but firm. "Tasha, you do belong here. You are part of this family, and that means you're wanted. It's not about what you've been through. It's about who you are now. We see you, Tasha. All of you. You don't have to hide. You're not a mistake." Tasha's eyes flickered with emotion, but she quickly wiped it away, turning her gaze back to her sketchbook. She said nothing more, and Jonathan knew better than to press her further. But the weight of her words lingered in the air, and he could feel the heaviness in his chest. He didn't have all the answers. He knew that, but he also knew that he wasn't going to give up on her. This was just another step in a journey that would take time, patience, and love. And no matter how hard it got, he would be there. He would help her see that she wasn't broken, that she wasn't the sum of her past mistakes. As the days turned into weeks, Tasha's struggles continued. There were small victories, like when she started sitting at the dinner table without her stuffed animal clutched in her arms, or when she began to ask questions about the family's traditions, like what they did for holidays and birthdays. But there were also setbacks, like when she would retreat to her room for hours, not speaking to anyone, or when she would stare blankly out the window, as if lost in her thoughts. One evening, Jonathan sat in the living room reading when he heard a soft knock on his office door. He looked up to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his face unusually serious. "Dad, can I talk to you for a minute?" Lucas asked. "Of course, Lucas," Jonathan replied, setting his book down. "Come in." Lucas hesitated, stepping inside the room slowly. He looked uncomfortable, as though the words he was about to say didn't quite fit together in his mind. "I've noticed. Tasha's been kind of distant. I mean, I get it. She's had a rough past, but it seems like she's never really let anyone in." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, giving his son his full attention. "You're right. Tasha is struggling to adjust. She's been through a lot, and learning to trust is not something that happens overnight." Lucas nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "I've been trying to talk to her, to get her to open up, but she's always shutting me out. I don't want her to feel like she's alone in all this, but it's like she doesn't want anyone around." Jonathan's heart swelled with pride for his son. Lucas wasn't perfect, but he was trying. He was starting to understand the complexities of the situation. It was clear that he cared about Tasha, even if he didn't know exactly how to help. "Sometimes it's not about talking to her, son," Jonathan explained. "Sometimes it's about showing her that you're there, that you care, even when she doesn't say anything. She's been hurt before, and she's learning to trust again. That takes time." Lucas looked thoughtful, clearly taking in his father's words. "I get that, but I still want to help her. I want her to know she's not alone in this." Jonathan smiled softly. "And you are helping, Lucas. By just being there, by showing her that you care, that's making a difference. Trust me, it's more than enough." As the months passed, The family continued to navigate the challenges of Tasha's adjustment. There were moments of breakthrough, like when Tasha finally joined them for a family movie night without retreating to her room, laughing along with the jokes and sharing in the warmth of the evening. And then there were the harder moments, when she would pull away or refuse to talk, when the old fears and insecurities resurfaced. But Jonathan never lost faith. He knew it was a long road, one that would take time, patience, and unconditional love. They were all learning together, growing together, and slowly but surely, they were becoming the family that Tasha had always needed, one step at a time. A glimmer of hope. Months had passed since Tasha moved in with Jonathan and his family, and while she still carried the weight of her past, there were signs of progress that warmed Jonathan's heart. It wasn't just the small victories like her speaking up at dinner or laughing at a family movie night. It was the subtle moments that spoke to her growing comfort and trust. The way she now greeted him with a shy smile when he came home from work, or how she would slip into the kitchen to help Emily make dinner, even if it was just setting the table or stirring a pot. She was no longer a stranger in their house. Slowly, the walls she had built around herself were starting to crack. One afternoon, as Jonathan worked in his office, he overheard the sounds of laughter coming from the kitchen. He smiled, knowing that Emily and Tasha were probably discussing something silly, maybe planning their next adventure or talking about their day. It was the kind of laughter that filled the house with warmth and a sense of belonging. When Jonathan finally went to check on them, he found Tasha standing by the counter, holding a notebook in her hands. She was showing Emily something, her face lighting up with pride. "Dad," Emily called out as she caught sight of him. "You have to see this. Tasha's been drawing again." Jonathan stepped closer, glancing over Tasha's shoulder. On the page in front of her was a sketch of a house, simple but beautifully detailed. In the drawing, there were trees in the yard, a mailbox with their family's name written on it, and a warm sun hanging in the sky above. It was the kind of drawing that a child might do in imagining their perfect home, a place of safety, warmth, and love. "Wow, Tasha," Jonathan said, his voice filled with admiration. "That's amazing. You've got real talent." Tasha's cheeks flushed with a mix of surprise and gratitude. She didn't often share her art with anyone, but there was something about this moment that made her feel proud. She looked up at Jonathan, her voice barely above a whisper. I like drawing. It makes me feel safe, like I can put everything down on paper." Jonathan smiled warmly, crouching down beside her. "That's exactly what art is supposed to do, Tasha. It's a way to express yourself, a way to show the world who you are, even when you don't have the words. I'm proud of you for sharing this with us." For the first time in a long while, Tasha's eyes glistened with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. The walls around her heart were still there, but this time, they felt just a little thinner. Her sketchbook had always been a private place for her, a world where she could escape her troubles and imagine a better future. But now, with Jonathan and Emily by her side, that world was starting to feel a little less lonely. Despite the progress, the pain of Tasha's past still lingered beneath the surface. She had days where the weight of everything she had endured became too much to bear, where she would retreat into herself and shut the world out. Jonathan noticed these moments, and while he couldn't always figure out how to help, he was determined to be there for her when she was ready. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Tasha became quiet, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee cup. Jonathan watched her closely, sensing that something was off. "Everything okay, Tasha?" he asked gently. Tasha nodded, though her eyes remained downcast. "Yeah, I'm just thinking." Jonathan gave her space, not wanting to push too hard, but he could tell that something was weighing on her. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice shaky. I don't know if I can ever truly be a part of this family. I know you're trying, but it's hard. I keep thinking that I'll mess everything up." Jonathan's heart ached as he heard her words. This was the fear that still haunted her, the fear that no matter how hard she tried, She wasn't worthy of love, that her past mistakes and struggles would always be a barrier she couldn't overcome. "Tasha," he began softly, leaning forward, "you don't have to be perfect. None of us are. We all make mistakes, and that's okay. What matters is that you're here, that you're trying, and that you're part of this family now. You are loved, and you always will be, no matter what." Tasha's shoulders trembled slightly, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might cry. But instead, she let out a deep breath, as though releasing a tension she had been holding for far too long. She didn't say anything, but the quiet moment between them spoke volumes. As the months continued to unfold, Tasha's bond with the family deepened. There were still moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she truly belonged. But those moments became fewer and farther between. She was starting to see herself through their eyes, not as a broken girl from the past, but as someone deserving of a future filled with love, hope, and possibility. One Saturday, Jonathan received an unexpected phone call from the principal at Tasha's new school. His heart skipped a beat as he answered, wondering if something had gone wrong. But the voice on the other end was warm and reassuring. "Mr. Carrington, I wanted to give you an update on Tasha. I've noticed a big change in her recently. She's been more engaged in class, participating more in discussions, and even helping other students with their work. She's really blossomed, and I just wanted to let you know how proud we are of her." Jonathan felt a surge of pride and emotion. "Thank you for letting me know," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "She's been working hard, and I'm so glad to hear that she's finding her place at school." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, and Jonathan couldn't help but smile as he hung up. Tasha was finally starting to believe in herself, not just at home, but in the world outside as well. She had always been more capable than she realized, and now she was showing everyone around her just how much strength she had. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Tasha did something she had never done before. She spoke about her day with a lightness in her voice that made Jonathan's heart swell with pride. "I helped a kid in class today," she said shyly. "He was struggling with math, so I showed him how to do the problem step by step. It felt good to help." Emily beamed at her. "That's awesome, Tasha. I knew you had it in you." Jonathan couldn't contain the pride in his voice. "I'm so proud of you, Tasha. You're making a difference, and you're showing everyone what you're capable of." For the first time, Tasha smiled, truly smiled. It wasn't a guarded, tentative smile. It was a smile that reflected the growth she had made in the months since moving in with them. She was no longer just a girl trying to fit into someone else's world. She was becoming her own person, one who was worthy of love, of acceptance, and of everything that family could offer. And Jonathan knew that, no matter what challenges they faced in the future, they would face them together. Tasha had found a place where she belonged, and for the first time in her life, she was starting to believe that she deserved it. The moment of redemption. It had been a year since Tasha entered Jonathan's home, a year full of hurdles, growth, and transformative moments. Tasha had changed in ways Jonathan never expected, but more than that, he had changed. The house that once felt empty in its quiet moments now felt full, brimming with a sense of hope and warmth that Jonathan hadn't realized was missing until it had been restored. The distance between Tasha and the rest of the family had narrowed, and while she wasn't completely healed from her past, she was well on her way to understanding what it meant to belong, to truly feel seen and loved. But for Jonathan, the real test was still yet to come. It came one afternoon when the phone rang while Jonathan was on a conference call. He glanced at the screen and saw a number he didn't recognize. As soon as he saw it, a strange, unsettling feeling stirred in his gut. He excused himself from the call and picked up the phone. "Hello, Mr. Carrington." The voice on the other end was smooth, but there was an undercurrent of tension. "This is Officer Reynolds from the Social Services Office. I'm afraid we need to talk to you about Tasha." Jonathan's pulse quickened. "What's happened? Is she okay?" "We're not sure yet, but there's been an issue. We need you to come in as soon as possible. It's about her biological parents." Jonathan's mind raced. For months, he'd tried to shield Tasha from the painful reality of her past. He had spoken with the social services agency to ensure that Tasha wouldn't have to interact with her biological parents again, but it seemed that something had gone awry. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Jonathan replied, trying to mask the anxiety in his voice. The drive to the social services office felt longer than it should have. Jonathan's thoughts spiraled as he gripped the steering wheel, wondering what this sudden call meant. Had Tasha's past come back to haunt her? Was she in danger? When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a small, sterile room. A woman in her late 40s sat behind a desk, her expression tight and professional. Officer Reynolds, the social worker who had contacted him, was standing next to her. "Mr. Carrington," the social worker began, offering a brief polite nod. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Jonathan nodded in return, his heart thudding in his chest. "What's going on? Is Tasha okay?" Reynolds sat down and met his gaze. "We've received a request from Tasha's biological mother. She's asking for visitation. We know that this is a complicated issue, and we wanted to speak with you before proceeding any further." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Her mother? He could hardly believe it. He had assumed Tasha's biological parents were out of the picture, had no idea where they were, or whether they even cared about her well-being. Yet here they were, resurfacing after all this time. "Yes," Reynolds confirmed, his expression unreadable. "According to the documents we've reviewed, her mother has recently been released from prison and is looking to reconnect with Tasha. We want to hear your thoughts on this before we move forward." Jonathan's mind raced. He could feel his protective instincts rising like a tide. There was no way Tasha was ready for something like this, not after everything she had been through. He thought of the long nights she had spent crying herself to sleep, of the walls she had built around herself to protect her from the world. She was just starting to heal, to find peace and stability in their family. He couldn't risk her being pulled back into the chaos of her past. "She's not ready for this," Jonathan said firmly, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Tasha has made so much progress. She's building a life here, and I won't let her biological parents disrupt that. They haven't been in her life for years. I'm the one who's been here for her. I won't let them hurt her again." The social worker looked thoughtful, but Reynolds didn't look convinced. "We understand your concerns, Mr. Carrington, but we have to take Tasha's feelings into account as well. She has a right to know her family, and this is a complex situation. We can't deny her the opportunity to make that decision for herself." Jonathan's chest tightened. The idea of Tasha having to face her biological mother, someone who had abandoned her, who had never been there when she needed love or support, seemed like too much. He had spent months earning her trust, showing her that family wasn't about blood, but about who was there for you when it mattered most. And now, this specter from her past was threatening everything they had built. "I'll talk to her," Jonathan said, his voice low. "But I won't let her go through this unless she's ready." That evening, Jonathan sat across from Tasha at the kitchen table. The weight of the conversation ahead pressed down on him, but he knew he had to tell her. He had promised himself that he would always be honest with her, even when the truth was hard to hear. "Tasha," Jonathan began, his voice gentle but firm. "I need to talk to you about something important, something that's going to affect you." Tasha looked up from her plate, her eyes filled with curiosity but also a trace of wariness. She had been doing better lately, more confident, more open, but she still hadn't fully let go of the fear that things might fall apart. "What is it, Dad?" she asked quietly. Jonathan sighed. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, searching for the right words. "Your biological mother has reached out. She's asking for visitation." Tasha froze, her fork clattering softly against the plate. "What do you mean? She wants to see me?" "Yes," Jonathan replied, trying to gauge her reaction. "She's out of prison now, and she's asking to reconnect." Tasha's face hardened, and for the first time in a long while, Jonathan saw the walls she had once erected around her heart start to build themselves again. Her eyes were dark with emotion, a mixture of anger and disbelief. I don't want to see her," Tasha said quickly, her voice thick with a mixture of pain and resolve. "She left me. She didn't care. She's not my mother." Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew this was just the beginning. "I know, Tasha, and I'm not going to let her hurt you again. We don't have to do anything you're not ready for. You've come so far, and I'm so proud of you." Tasha's gaze softened for a moment, but the wariness never fully left her eyes. "What if I do want to see her one day? What if I'm ready?" Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility. "If you ever decide that you're ready, we'll figure it out together. But for now, I'm here, on your family, and nothing is going to change that." Tasha's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, as though processing everything in her own quiet way. "I'm not going anywhere, Tasha," Jonathan said softly. "You don't have to face this alone." And in that moment, Tasha knew. She knew that no matter what her past held, no matter what came next, she had a family who would stand by her, a family who would help her navigate the storm that was brewing on the horizon. For the first time in her life, she truly believed it.